Hey, what's up guys? And today's video is going to be a little different. Today we're going to be discussing something that's near and dear to my heart, and something I've actually touched on a few times on this channel, and that's my personal relationship with the Frisco 1522 and why it has led me to do what I do as a hobby. So sit back, relax, and let's get started, shall we? So, like I said, this video is going to be a little different from most other videos. The first thing you're probably going to notice is that I'm not actually doing live gameplay like I normally do for these Railworks Sundays type videos. This is going to be interspersed with clips of the Frisco 1500 from Machine Rails and from real life footage that my dad took back in 2002. We're going to have like footage back and forth of this kind of stuff. But I want to talk about a little bit, in some ways, something that has probably been very active, at least in terms of the rumor mill lately. And that is the fact that the Frisco 1522, as it stands right now, there's a rumor going around that she's being looked over to see if she's possibly going to be able to be restored back to operating service. So for those of you that don't know, this year, 2026, marks the 100th birthday of the Frisco 1522. In fact, I actually went over there to, well, not pay my respects, but kind of visit her. I consider her part of the family and as much as I consider her an old friend and all this kind of stuff. And I've only gotten to see her run once when I was a little kid, and that's kind of the clip you're seeing right on the screen now. This is at the Museum of Transportation, where she is based out of, and this was probably sometime before her final runs on September 28th and 29th of 2002. There's no specific date on this particular part of the recording, but the next following recordings of the locomotive, are from her final run on September 28th, and these were taken by my dad. Now, I mentioned a while back when I shared that video that I did plan to kind of talk about the locomotive a little bit more in a sort of dedicated video, but that never came to fruition. And now, with the 100th birthday being around here and these rumors circulating about the locomotive being possibly restored back to operation, I figured now it would be as good as time as any to kind of talk a little bit about what has driven me over the years to be a part of the railroading community, basically the hobby, why I love trains so much, and why essentially I do what I do on YouTube as a hobby on this main channel. Now, I also have two other channels. I've mentioned this a few other times. I have the Otaku Gamer, which is kind of more or less abandoned at this time, but that was kind of the originally this channel was more of a generalized gaming channel, but when I started posting Trains A New Era content, it became a kind of dedicated hub for trains, railroading simulator stuff, in general. And the first video on the channel, which is long since disappeared, was a rail fanning video that I made kind of quickly on Trains 12. This was well before this was like, I think a few months before Trains New Era came out, and it was of the Nickel Plate Road 587. And that was another locomotive I had been interested in for a while. And I'd always heard the stories that she had been falling out of service because of various issues, not too dissimilar of what the stories I had heard of the Frisco 1522 were. And interestingly enough, that rail fanning video never stuck around. In fact, I actually deleted it off the channel a long time ago. It was privated for a long time, and then I just eventually deleted it. So the oldest video on my channel is the first ever playthrough of Trains New Era back when it was still in a beta stage. There was a time where the game could have been, as soon as you ordered the game, bought the game on Steam, you got an early version of it before it became the version that it is today. But keep in mind, this is all going on down in 2015, 2016. fast forward a few years in about 2018, and I get to live out a part of my dream that I've had since I was a little kid. And going back to the 1522, when I first saw the locomotive, it wasn't because I saw it in person for the first time. That obviously left an impression on me. It's still a very big part of my life to this day, is knowing that I was at the museum the final couple of years, the final months of that locomotive service life. I do have a distinct memory of that locomotive going through Eureka, and I actually relived it to some extent back on July 20th of this year with the 4014, because it had the same sort of situation. But when I was 3 years old, the story goes, that the story I've been told about how I fell in love with trains was that when I was 3 years old, my mom and dad were out on a date night, and me and my middle brother were home with a babysitter. The babysitter, who was, I guess, told that I loved the Disney's Pinocchio, put that on for me to fall asleep to. Well, right at the scene where the whale is chasing Pinocchio and Giuseppe, I think is his name. I don't know the main character's name, but when the whale is chasing Pinocchio, I started to cry. Well, the babysitter, coming in and thinking quickly, changes the tape out for a videotape that my dad recorded in 1990 of the Union Pacific 844, as she was in St. Louis at the time. Well, I ended up falling asleep to that tape. And a few years later, when I was about 5 or 6, when we moved out to where we live now, I had this VHS tape, which is now available on YouTube. The Virgin Clear has this very same tape that I used to watch as a kid, over and over again, to the point where the VCR actually ate the tape and actually destroyed it. And I eventually bought a new version of the same tape on eBay years later. But this very same documentary that I would watch over and over as a kid, and in fact I've actually probably watched it a half a dozen times this month, of the Frisco 1522 on the Wisconsin Central, and our first couple excursions out of St. Louis. That was the tape I grew up with. That was the memories I had so vividly of the 1522 when I was a little kid. Keep in mind that this was 98, 99, 2000 when I was doing this. And there was another VHS tape called the Marathon of Steam Volume 4. This was a Greg Scholl VHS tape that had 2 documentaries on the same tape. The one of which was the 1990 NRHS convention in St. Louis. The same one where the 844 was where my dad had recorded the 844. And that was another tape that I had distinct memories of, because the first half of the tape was of the Sierra Railway, I believe it was number 28 and in the video, that was pulling some excursions at the time, some sort of like special excursion or something like that. But the second half of the tape is the one I most distinctly remember. And years later, I would actually buy from Greg Scholl, the Greg Scholl Video Productions, the DVD of that particular part of the tape. And that was something that, again, holds a very special place in my heart, because that's the very collection of locomotives that my dad actually has photographs of. He was at Union Station in 1990, and he took pictures of all 4 of the big steam locomotives that were there. We have them buried somewhere in our house, and I would love to scan them and put them up online, because there's a lot of like old pictures of the 1522 when it was in operations that we have, and we have not gotten them off the media that we have, but they're there. We have them. But the distinct pictures that I remember were all 4 locomotives lined up. He took 2 pictures specifically, one of the 844 and the 1522 next to each other, and the other one was of 1218 and 819 next to each other. And these 2 images are burned into my memory because they were some of the earliest photos that I remember my dad taking of these locomotives, and they were something I would always stare at when I was a little kid. Well, when 2001, 2002 came around, and we heard the stories of, we had heard initially that the 1522 was going to go to Quincy, Illinois. This was going to be we didn't know this at the time, but this was going to be its final trip up north, it's Quincy, Illinois. And we didn't know, they never publicized this. It wasn't known until much later, years later, in fact, that that excursion in March of 2002 to Quincy, Illinois was going to be her final trip up to Quincy. Because just a few months later, the St. Louis Steam Train Association, which was operating the locomotive at the time, had announced the final series of excursions she would pull between St. Louis and Newburgh just a few months later in September. So on September 28th, 2002, my dad actually got tickets prior to this excursion. Well, he got a ticket to ride behind the Frisco 1522. And that is the footage you're basically seeing on the trackside special, where it shows the perspective of my dad throughout the trip. Well, throughout most of the trip. A good chunk of the tape that we converted had Digimon recorded over it because I was a little kid and messed up the tape, and a small portion of it actually had Super Smash Bros. Melee footage on it, again because I was a little kid and we screwed around with the tape. But a good chunk of that footage is still there. It's only like a small portion of it that's all missing. And my dad did say that he actually had the old original tape that he used the camcorder for, that used those in the camcorder somewhere buried in our collection of junk, I guess you could say. But it was during this particular trip on September 28th, 2002, that my dad called me from the train to the house. And this is back in the day where you had where cell service was not as, like, smartphones weren't a thing as big as much as they are now. So he called me from his basically the equivalent of a flip phone, and told me to go outside and listen. And I remember the exact spot where I was standing. I remember the time of day, the look, the feel, everything. The sun was kind of just behind a hill, and all of a sudden, as I'm standing there listening, I hear this faint Hancock long bell 3-chime going off in the distance. And I could swear to you to this day that I could hear the bell as it's going through, blasting through Eureka, which is approximately a 10-minute or so drive away from the house, but it's not that far. And that memory sticks into my head so much more than anything else to this day. And because I was so young at the time, and it stuck with me so long, I actually brought this up a couple times with my dad about how distinct that memory is to me, and he obviously doesn't remember all too much of it. But it's because I had such a close connection with the locomotive and kind of my history with trains and railroading that it always was distinct to me. I also remember the trip to Quincy a little bit. We went to Clarksville, Missouri, which was quite a ways up north from where we live. And we caught the 1522 when it made a surfacing stop in Clarksville. And there's a picture. I don't know if we still have it, but I remember my dad took a picture of us, and I saw this for a little bit. It's on an early digital camera, so it was not very good quality. But it was this picture of me and my middle brother standing in front of the 1522 as it's being serviced at Clarksville. And we have this small little Digimon toy of Terriermon. And this was right around the time the Digimon movie had come out, too. Because this was 2001, 2002. And we were standing there. We actually paced the 1522 for a short time. And some of the pictures of that pacing are on the internet today, but none of them are ours. And because I don't have permission to share these pictures, I'm not going to show them on the internet, on here, but they're out there. If you look up the 1520, in fact, there's a good video from on YouTube called 1522 at her best, and it's of that same Quincy trip in 2002. So it's actually like some footage there, and I believe there's some pacing shots in there. So it's worth going to take a look at how she was towards the end of her career. This channel also has a complete run of her final run on September 28th, 2002. And there's like a lot of her footage of the 1522's final years was captured on old video recordings, and they're all on, and most of them are on YouTube. But by earlier this year, it was kind of revealed by a member of the board of the Museum of Transportation that they were looking into whether or not it would be feasible to restore the Frisco 1522. And because this was such a big part of my childhood, it actually got my attention, which is why I started to make this video in the first place. This video is kind of like a sort of detailed history of like me and the 1522 in a sense, and how much that locomotive means to me. It was a big part of my childhood, and when it was retired, to this day, I actually have moments where if I see certain videos of the 1522, there's a very, very distinct video of her departing Pacific, Missouri in the dead of night. She was running very late on her final trip on September 29th. And by the time she got to downtown St. Louis, I think it was 11 p.m. So it was almost midnight. And basically, that day sticks out of my mind as well, because we actually tried to catch the 1522 as it would go through Pacific and towards downtown St. Louis. Well, we were later told by a passerby, we were sitting at a spot just outside of Pacific, and a guy that was chasing, already keeping basically a better a lot more distinct chaser than us. He's told us as he saw us sitting there, like, hey, yeah, the 1522 is running late and it's probably already gone through here. And my dad was obviously pissed. But what we didn't know was that it had already gone through the other direction. It was still going towards Newburgh at the time. And we did not know that. It would be years later when I got another DVD called the Frisco 1522, A Grand Farewell. And that's from Good Heart Video Productions. And by the way, it's a good DVD. I actually used some of the audio from that DVD because there's a version of the video that's got no narration, and I used some of the audio from that to make the enhancement pack for the Frisco 1500 set from Machine Rails. But my dad got pissed, and we eventually went home. We would never see the locomotive run again. Well, when I came across some videos years later of the 1522 departing Pacific at the dead of night, heading to St. Louis, the first time I watched it, I actually started to tear up. I actually started to cry. Because you could tell that there was just this feeling that this is it. This is the final day. This is the final run, and we're running late. As soon as they crack open the throttle, you hear the stack just blast like loud as can be. And it's this, like, we got to get moving. We got to catch up. We got to get ahead of schedule. We got to get back on track. And you can hear that the locomotive is picking up speed faster and faster, much faster than it normally would when it would be departing Pacific. And this moment kind of got me choked up a little bit, because knowing full well that was the final moments of her career in excursion service at the time, it was just this sort of like gut-wrenching feeling. A couple months ago, I got a DVD call from Diverging Clear Productions. Again, I mentioned them before with the old Greg Scholl documentary that I mentioned, but they made a DVD collection called 1522, A Retrospective. And the final clip of that DVD is of the 1522 on September 30th, 2002. She's in the museum. She's pulled out towards the edge of the museum grounds, and they start blowing her down. Basically, her fire was already extinguished at that point, and she was not producing steam. So they started to blow her down, and as they were doing so, the crew was blowing the whistle. Basically a final send-off to the locomotive, saying, this is it, we're done, we're through. And, God, I'm actually tearing up trying to describe this. And it's just this gut-wrenching moment, because as the boiler pressure starts to drop, you start to hear the whistles just fading farther and farther and getting less and less pressure. And the final clip has the camera on the rail, on one of the rails, and you hear just faintly the whistle just barely let out a whimper as it just like comes to a, like as it becomes finally cold and dark. And that moment stuck with me. I was not there for it, but just watching that clip made me actually cry, because it was to me, these locomotives are living, breathing things. These are living objects. They have a personality. They have emotion. They have just this quirk. They have quirks. They're all unique in some way. And seeing that video really gave the impression that she was tired. She was going to sleep, and she was probably never going to wake up. And it was probably one of the most gut-wrenching moments. And I've had a few moments like that, and all of which were of me remembering the emotions I felt when I learned the 1522 was finally retired. And it just stuck with me. But I've always had this dream of getting the locomotive back to operation, of getting the 1522 back into service. And when the rumor started about lately, and with photographic evidence, and I'm actually showing the photos on screen now because they're everywhere at this point. This is a rumor that's been floating around for many people in the rail industry. And it's just the fact that this is a possibility again, it makes me want to join an effort. Because if it does see the light of day, if it does return to service, I personally will want to be a part of that restoration effort. Because this locomotive was a big part of my childhood. This locomotive was what I grew up with. It's like me, it's like I grew up with, it's like an old friend. It's an old childhood friend of mine. And that's how I view the 1522. It's a family friend. It's a childhood friend. And with what little we have in terms of what we can relive, whether it be videos, games, sounds, stuff like this. Like, I commissioned the Frisco 1500 pack from Machine Rails back in December of 2021. And I think it was a year later they actually released the content. And what I didn't expect them to do was actually, I only commissioned the 1522, the auxiliary tender, and the 4 crew cars. What I didn't expect them to do was the 3 freight cars that came with the pack, as well as a weathered variant of the Frisco 1500s. And from what I was told by a few people that worked with the project, it was more of a test to see what they could do, because the previous release before that was the Illinois Central 1500 pack. And they wanted to, and the guy behind Machine Rails wanted to test out some new techniques with reskinnings, and he's kind of applied that with other DLCs since then. But when I got that DLC, when I got that locomotive pack, it was something that I really wanted to do for a long time. I always wanted to see the 1522 in Train Sim Classic, in Railworks. And we had already had a version of the 1522 from K&L Trains. We always had this particular version of the locomotive for a good, oh god, it's been at least, it was introduced in Trains A New Era, I believe, and has since stuck around for a while. And I think when that particular version of 1522 came out, I actually quickly grabbed it. I think I was like one of the earliest buyers of that particular version of the locomotive. And I knew that like there were models of the 1522 out there for other sims. There's a version of her in MSTS. There's a version of her, which by extension is there for open rails. There's one for trains, but there was never one for Railworks, which is one of the biggest simulators in the genre. The only other simulator that kind of competes with Railworks is trains, and they already had them all. So I went ahead and commissioned the Frisco 1500s from Machine Rails, knowing full well that not everybody was going to grab it, because it was one of those things where it's like, it's not on Steam, it's not an official DLC, and the community for Railworks is kind of limited. It's kind of split into two different camps, I feel. There's the camp that is dedicated to the Steam workshop side of things and Steam, and only get Steam DLCs, stuff like that. And then you get the other camp, like people like myself, who love modding and getting third-party content from other developers on their own personal sites. So I was quickly one of those people that grabbed the Frisco 1500s and just started to mess around with it. And one of the first things I was going to do from the very beginning, as soon as the pack came out, even before the pack came out, was to actually start working on an enhancement pack. And that's what I did. I made an enhancement pack that featured new running sounds, a new bell, a new whistle, a new sound for the dynamo, a new sound for the compressor. These were all sounds I actually had to put into the game and put into the locomotive to make it better. I even made an alternate version of a couple of versions of the locomotive. One featuring the 1980s plate that was seen on the front of the locomotive during her first trip out of St. Louis. A version of her during her short-lived freight career in 1959, where she's got a doghouse tender. Just these various different designs of the locomotive from this pack, and this was all because I have a strong connection with this locomotive. I've seen like what little if there's a video of the 1522 out there, I've most likely seen it in some way, shape, or form, because she's a hometown engine. She's a hometown, and she's part of my childhood. And by extension, I always wanted to kind of give out this sort of feel of like, this is more personal to me. That's why, like, I don't really get involved with too much with like making sure that I'm family friendly and all this kind of stuff. It's a personal journey. It's a hobby. It's always been a hobby. Trains and railroading have always been my particular hobby since I was 3 years old, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the video. And today, as I'm sitting down here recording this, we are about a week removed from the 4014's visit to St. Louis. That day, on July 20th, when she was leaving St. Louis, I was planning on chasing her down through Gray Summit, which is, again, not far from the house. But I wasn't able to go. But I still knew that there would be videos of her going through the areas that I was planning on visiting. But when I was laying on my bed, just sitting there, just relaxing, all of a sudden I heard this rumbling sound outside the window. I don't live close to the tracks. Like I said, I live a good distance away, about a 10-minute drive from several key areas, including Pacific, Eureka, all these big towns where the railroad runs right through. I live a good distance away. And when I started hearing that rumbling, I'm like, wait a minute, that's probably the 4014. Knowing full well that she was a much louder locomotive than an ES-44 traveling down the same line. And we are close enough that we can hear trains rolling through the towns just further down, but we can barely hear the prime movers of these diesels. We can hear the horns just fine, but we can barely hear the prime movers. But that day, I heard a rumbling sound that was coming straight through the house, and I realized that's 4014. That's the same that's the locomotive that is running through town at high speeds, charging the Kirkwood grade as she's making her way back to Cheyenne. And by the time this video goes up, she's already home. She's already back in Cheyenne. She's waiting for her next assignment. And it's just, the love of steam, the love of railroading has always been with me since I was 3. And I always wanted to share my love of steam, my love of railroading with everybody else. I have always been this sort of talking. I have habit of running on, and I mean, like, this particular part of the recording itself is like 20 minutes of me rambling on about trains and railroads and my love of the 5022 and my history with it and kind of this end of an era. Or at least at the time, an end of an era. So it's just, I just want to keep preserving that sort of history and why I do this. I do this because I love the trains and railroading. I've always been a rail fan at my core. Since, like I said, since I was 3 years old. And if these rumors prove to be true, and the 1522 is brought into a position where it's going to be restored, you know damn well I am going to try my best to get involved with that restoration effort. But with that said, guys, thank you guys so much for sticking around, listening to me ramble on about this. Like and comment down below. Subscribe if you guys want more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.